Let's talk a little bit about how this looks in practice. This is what a traditional nonprofit looks like, right? The board is in charge. The board represents the American people for a nonprofit. And American people own nonprofits. That's how it works. The board oversees an executive director in a traditional model who oversees other staff who oversee volunteers. So it's very top down or left right, this model. But you can have co-directors, which this looks a lot more like what our nonprofit looks like. So we have a board that oversees co-directors, and we actually don't have any other staff at the moment, but we have in the past. So we would each oversee other staff and volunteers. You can have a member-owned nonprofit where the members directly elect the board, who then oversee the executive director who oversees other people. In this model, the board sort of regenerates itself typically. So people nominate themselves or are nominated as board members, and the board votes about who else should be on the board. Starting board for the first time can be a little tricky, right? Because who picks the first board? There's no clear answer. Staff usually. You can have a member-owned co-op. So a lot of traditional co-ops like grocery stores operate this way, where there's a pool of members who all benefit from the organization. So they all, get to buy their groceries there, and they elect members to a board. So there's a rotating sort of representative body of the members. You can also have worker ownership. So we have some elements of this here at the library. Our staff decide, we get our budget approved by the board, and there's a chunk that's for compensation and benefits. And then our staff collectively decide how we're going to spend that money on compensation and benefits. We have a lot of autonomy. So that's an area where the board has authority. They decide how much money can get spent. And then we have autonomy to figure out how that money that affects us directly, our salary and benefits, how that gets spent. And then we do the work. So we also have the administrative leadership. And in any of these models can use different decision-making modes, right? Here at the Tool Library, we use consensus, which is complicated, but beautiful. To use consensus, there are a lot of guides out there. There's a lot of training. It could be something that we talk about in a future session. But the core of any successful consensus-based organization is agreed upon values and goals. The biggest difference, I think, between consensus and voting is not that everyone agrees. It's that consensus necessarily has to be made. So when you disagree with something in a consensus organization, you disagree based on values. You say this is in conflict with our values or our stated goals. When you vote, you can vote based on values, but typically it's not done that way. Typically a vote is, I think this is a good idea. I don't think this is a good idea. Our representatives in the US, for example, are elected based on how we think they're going to vote, not necessarily on their adherence to our core values. I love consensus. It takes time. It's a really difficult culture to build, but I think it's really worth it. If for no other reason than it really makes you think about what your values are and what they mean to you. And then there are different kinds of voting models. So you can have a plurality vote, which means that more than half, like a certain number, 75%, 60%, need to be in favor of a proposal for it to pass. This is our backup. So for our board, if consensus cannot be reached, we can default to a plurality vote. Just to make sure that something moves forward. We never want to do that, but it's an option for us. Because really what that means is that some of the people in the room would see the organization doing something that feels out of step with our values and get outvoted. That doesn't feel good, and it's probably not in the best interest of the organization. And then there's a simple majority vote, right? This is majority rules. More than half the parties are in favor. Something goes forward, or the reverse. Before I move forward, are there any questions about any of these things?
Yeah, I had a question about your consensus-based decision-making. So, how many people does that involve typically when you're doing a consensus-based decision?
That's a really good question. So our board uses consensus, and our co-director team uses consensus. So at most, we have 12 people. When we have made decisions in our sort of more informal years, we had 30 to 40 volunteers who would come together once a month. We had a volunteer meeting. We decided stuff as a group. We did not use consensus then because it was too large a group and people they weren't connected enough with our core values to preclude some of those. I just don't agree with that. Not agreeing with that personally doesn't work with consensus. We, for the most part, try to make our formal organizational decisions with the staff and the board. We're going to talk a little bit more later about how members, volunteers, other folks fit into decision-making. But I will say one of the biggest pitfalls, one of the biggest holes that I see organizations fall into that leads to lack of trust in leadership is a lack of clarity around what someone's role is in making a decision. So it's been really important for us, we'll talk about this towards the end of the presentation, to define whether you are being asked for input, whether we just want information from you. So not even your opinion, just like, how many tools typically get lent versus do you think we're lending tools the right way versus how should we lend tools, right? So being asked for information, for input, to be part of making a decision or to make a decision independently are all really different. And so making that clear to people up front, as a volunteer, you will be asked to give input on decisions, but you won't necessarily get to vote on what the decision is, for example. That is something to be really careful about. So that's a long answer to your question. Our board and staff use consensus. In other groups, we're typically not making large scale decisions, but when we do something like when we implemented our code of conduct recently, we wanted to get consensus from everyone because that was a really big deal. And anyone who didn't respond, we recorded as stood aside, basically neither yes nor no.